Our story begins in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. It was an ordinary sunny day outside. There was absolutely nothing to indicate impending disaster. Suddenly, there was a terrifying explosion. The city was destroyed in an instant and engulfed in merciless flames. In history, this day was marked as X Day. A nuclear bomb launched by another country hit the very heart of Korea. But now we will return 3 years before this tragedy. Our hero had already begun to actively prepare for a terrifying future. Now, literally, from every iron everywhere, they are trumpeting that humanity is already on the brink of the apocalypse. But despite this, only 2 groups of people prepared for it. And one of them were the rich, the most powerful people in the world, because in their position, they have to worry about everything. The second group included people who truly believed in the coming end of the world so strongly that they were ready to risk everything. Our Thomas belonged precisely to this category. To begin with, he got rid of all his assets. After that, he began to greedily absorb all the information that could at least hypothetically help him survive. And the first thing our hero was concerned about was finding a place suitable for building a shelter. Thomas selected it quite carefully. After some thought, he identified 3 key requirements for a suitable location, after which he highlighted the possible options on the map. His first criterion was a sparsely populated area where hardly anyone would come even in the most extreme case, but not too far from the city. Secondly, the terrain had to give Thomas an advantage in case of attack. The very last criterion, perhaps the most important of all, is cost. The hero carefully explored all the places he had highlighted on the map. And finally, he found a worthy place. Next to it, there was a deserted forest belt near the Air Force Base on the outskirts of the capital area. Without wasting any time, Thomas immediately settled there. He was lucky enough to live next to an old man with whom they did household chores together. The hero did not remember the name of this old man, but he remembered his last name, Kim. He was the owner of the land near the Air Force Base. Soon, Thomas found workers who agreed to help bring his project to life. He provided them with all the necessary equipment and said that he would also work with them. At first, the builders were against the hero taking part in their stormy activities. But the price of the issue turned out to be small enough to solve this dilemma. All it took was a couple of bottles and a couple of plates. Suddenly, during one of their get-togethers, sand flew at the head of one of the workers. Old man Kim was extremely unhappy and shouted that they were making noise and drinking here every day, after which he asked if they even had permission to do this. Thomas was, of course, unhappy with his interference, but there was nothing he could do about it. He himself did not understand whether the old man's behavior was due to the possessiveness inherent in the outback or not, but he saw no other reasons. None of them guessed that the reason why this lonely old man was constantly bothering them was completely different. Kim simply lacked attention, so every time he came up with something new to attract the attention of others, this time he even lay down on the ground in front of the tractor, not letting it go further. Ivan's patience, standing next to Tom, was already running out, so he decided that it was time to finally explain to the old man that it would be better for him not to interfere, but the hero stopped him. He snatched the axe from the man's hand. Afterwards, with a threatening look in his eyes, he sternly said that he would deal with everything himself. The hero miraculously managed to preserve the grains of his own patience and convinced the team to continue working, ignoring Kim. Returning from the store that same evening, he witnessed a rather unpleasant scene. A car stopped near old man Kim's house, and a man and a woman got out. The man insisted that the old man transfer the land to him in exchange for promising to take care of him. When Kim refused, the man began to shout, wondering why the old man was being so stubborn. In a fit of emotion, he grabbed him by the chest and pulled him towards himself. Edgar expressed his dissatisfaction with the fact that the old man gave the best lands to his sister, and he was left with only rice fields and a dilapidated house. Filled with anger, the man threw his father away from him, and he hit his back painfully on the protruding stones on the ground. Our hero's patience, which was on the brink, snapped at the sight of this scene. Groaning and clutching his back, old man Kim tried to rise. Edgar expected that after this he would agree to rewrite the lands. But when this did not happen, he took a swing at the old man, once again voicing his proposal. Thomas walked closer to them and cleared his throat, drawing their attention to himself. Then he gave Edgar a cold, expressive look, saying that he had better not do what he had planned. The man quietly cursed under his breath and waved his hand, sending everyone here to hell. Finally, he said that if he didn't get his land, he would burn everything here to the ground. Having said this, he got back into the car and drove away. Seeing the car disappearing over the horizon, Thomas sighed heavily. Then he turned his gaze to the old man, who had become much sadder. He offered him a cigarette, and the hero agreed, sitting down next to him. Thomas was the first to break the tense silence, asking why the old man didn't want to sell the land and move, since it was quite difficult to manage such an area on his own. He looked into the void in front of him, taking his time answering. A few moments later, he finally answered, saying that originally the part of the land given to his daughter was a useless wasteland, just like this one. He couldn't even predict that the government would decide to build a 10-lane highway there. Old man Kim smiled sadly, repeating the question of Thomas, who was sitting next to him. The image of his deceased wife, smiling happily, appeared before his eyes, and he said that he could never give this land to anyone. He has too many dear memories here that help him live on. The old man slowly stood up, saying that they had been sitting too long and it was time for them to go home. His unsmoked cigarette remained lying there. Thomas remained, looking at the old man's retreating back. After this conversation, old man Kim's heart opened a little. He stopped interfering with the workers doing their jobs. Thus, day after day passed, Thomas sitting with the old man from time to time and exchanging a few words. And finally, that very day X came. What happened in the city did not pass by the nearby settlements. A deafening roar shook the earth, and immediately after it, a belated siren announced the end of the world. Without delay, Thomas immediately rushed into his newly built bunker. Suddenly, an old man called out to him, and in a trembling voice he said that his son lived in Seoul and asked him to find him. He was in real horror and despair. The information he had read earlier immediately surfaced in the hero's memory. Looking at the old man, he replied that his son had already died, and there was no point in looking for him. These words cut painfully into Kim's heart, and he lowered his head and clutched his hat, which he held in his hand with all his strength. Thomas looked at him with a bit of sympathy and said that there would soon be a second wave of bombing, so he suggested that he hide in the bunker. The old man patted him on the shoulder and said sadly that he would not be able to leave his house. And thanking him for this offer, he quietly went back. Thomas hid in his bunker, surviving the disaster that had begun. Let's go back 2 years. Thomas would occasionally go hunting with old man Kim, and this time they managed to shoot a wild boar. It wasn't difficult for the hero to dig a little deeper and find out that his neighbor was a military man in the past. He also noticed that the old man always carried an old Walter with him, which was incredibly useful, but it could hardly save him from the coming horrors. Our hero carefully monitored his surroundings, not relaxing his vigilance for a moment. He also kept glancing towards the Air Force Base. Both Korean and American troops were stationed there at the same time. They also included hunters, a squad specializing in fighting various monsters. Michael considered this base an excellent condition to acquire suitable weapons. Thomas had even already developed a fairly simple plan. When the war starts, he planned to immediately target the base. After the explosion, there will be complete chaos, so the hero will put on the OZK and calmly take what he needs. While the hero was thinking through further details, an unexpected opportunity found him when he was suddenly offered to buy a gun. It was one of his workers named Sergei. From conversations, he learned that the man was Chinese but had moved to Korea and had previously been in a gang. Thomas also managed to find out that Sergei still maintains contact with his old colleagues from the gang. From the very beginning, the hero was wary of him, carefully analyzing all the newly received information. So when Sergei suggested that he get a gun, he thought about it. A few moments later, he nodded slightly and extended his hand to the man. Afterwards, Thomas replied that he would look at what Sergei offered him, but only after the construction was completed. A couple of months later, the day of sale arrived. During this time, our hero managed to hire a private detective and with his help found out that Sergei was in no way connected with the bandits from the Korean group, but was a member of the Shanghai Triad and the goods were taken from there. But Thomas didn't care about any of this. Soon, Sergei himself appeared at the designated place and called the hero closer. Afterwards, the man pointed behind him, saying that his guys would soon bring the goods, but for now, they needed to wait. They waited for the goods in silence. Sergei's attention was focused on the phone, and Thomas was thinking about his own things, glancing at his former employee from time to time. Suddenly, Sergei received a message. The hero carefully looked into the screen of the man standing next to him and asked if this was really his daughter. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head and replied that she had recently turned 7 and was constantly asking how soon he would return home. A few moments later, a van pulled into the street. Sergei took a few steps forward, saying that the goods had already been delivered. As they approached, several people came out to meet them and brought out the goods they had brought. One of the men explained that there were 3 rifles, Type 56 and caliber 7.6, and 300 rounds of ammunition. Thomas looked over the goods thoughtfully and, bending down, picked up one of the rifles. He examined it carefully and concluded that the weapon was in fairly good condition. Having finished his inspection, he returned the rifle to its place. Meanwhile, Sergei was talking with his guys. A joyful smile shone on his face. Feeling Thomas's gaze on her, the smile immediately disappeared. He walked towards him with sharp steps and a threatening expression on his face, and reminded the hero of his words about how he was going to live alone in the bunker. Upon hearing this, Thomas immediately became wary. He followed with his gaze how Sergei's palm covered the rifle. The man himself assumed that it would most likely be difficult for him alone. The hero frowned slightly and said that sometimes there are problems, but overall it's not that bad. Sergei looked at him seriously, thinking about something. Noticing this, Thomas smiled and asked if he really wanted to help him. He himself quietly put his hand behind his back and touched the hatchet hidden in his clothes. Sergei was silent for a few moments, considering his proposal, but then he smiled and politely declined. He held his palms out in front of him and said that he would not dare violate Thomas's personal boundaries. Then he turned to the van, saying that if anything happened, Thomas now knew who to contact, and added that he would send him the cartridges and clips after payment was made. The hero remained in his place, looking at the car as it moved away. He was sure that Sergei would return to do what he could not do today. Our hero's fears came true, and this happened on the very first day of the disaster. Thomas turned his gaze from the screen of his mobile phone, which Sergei was constantly calling, to the screen of the monitor with cameras. He saw a man get out of a car parked nearby. In his hand was a sharpened axe. Thomas already imagined his next step because Sergei knew the layout of this bunker perfectly, since he himself had built it. He turned his heavy gaze back to the phone screen, after which he pressed the answer button and held the phone to his ear. As soon as this happened, Sergei jumped up. When Thomas asked what he wanted, he replied that he had simply decided to deliver the package to him personally. The hero didn't answer him, analyzing the situation. Afterwards, he put the phone aside, cutting off the connection, and picked up an axe, deciding that there would be no problem since there was only one opponent. He walked slowly out, clutching the weapon in his hands. Sergei didn't have to wait long to press. Thomas was determined to deal with him as soon as possible before any more uninvited guests arrived. His gaze was cold and dangerous, like that of a predator patiently waiting for its prey. Sergei decided not to hesitate and almost immediately rushed at him, swinging an axe. But Thomas ducked, successfully avoiding the blow. Afterwards, he quickly moved behind the enemy, and without a second's delay, he attacked, striking at the neck. At that very moment, a deep wound appeared on Sergei's body from which blood spurted. Thomas decided not to stop there and raised his axe again to strike. Bleeding, Sergei grabbed the wound on his neck with his hand and wheezed, asking the hero who he was, if he was really a secret soldier of the Special Services. He lowered his other free hand to the ground, helping himself not to fall. Instead of answering, Thomas gave him a cold look. If just a few moments ago Sergei was completely confident of his victory, now the situation has changed dramatically. Still wheezing and writhing in pain, Sergei grabbed him by the leg and began to beg for help. The hero stood silently for a few moments. Afterwards, he said dryly that he would hardly be able to do anything. At the end, he added that even if he didn't finish him off, Sergei himself would die from blood loss. Exhaling loudly, the man whispered that in that case he would prefer death at the hands of Thomas. The hero fulfilled the last request without a drop of regret. He made sure that Sergei met his end quickly. Suddenly, his attention was caught by the sound of a ringing bell. Thomas knelt down next to the body and reached for the vibrating pocket. He was afraid that Sergei had brought someone else here. However, it was not the man's accomplices who called him, but his daughter. The hero remembered that Sergei had a little daughter whom he told him about. Having unlocked the phone, Thomas immediately came across their correspondence, in which the man he had killed promised to return home as quickly as possible. A month has passed since then, and as soon as the radiation level dropped a little, our hero immediately went to the Air Force Base. He walked among the ruins of destroyed buildings and looked around carefully. Suddenly, something caught his attention and made him stop. He was lucky enough to find El Dorado, a weapon powerful enough to deal with an entire group of mercenaries. Thomas walked slowly inside the building, happy that his original plan had worked like a charm. On the way, he noticed a parked car. It contained the charred skeletons of unfortunate victims of a nuclear bombing. In a way, Thomas felt sorry for them, but he was powerless to change anything, so he turned around and moved on. Having done everything he needed to, Thomas left the base. From time to time, the image of Sergei would pop up in his thoughts. He wondered what would have happened if this man had not met him and whether he would have been able to reunite with his daughter. But looking at the landscape surrounding him, all the pictures of a happy family painted by his imagination were shattered on the rocks of reality. It would have been simply impossible to survive in such an environment. In his free time, of which he now had a lot, our hero did handicrafts, making dolls out of felt. He repeated every step exactly as shown in the video. This video was made after the start of the nuclear war by an anonymous person under the nickname 337. This became possible thanks to a community of people who believed in the end of the world. One big businessman launched a satellite into orbit, and so even after the war, people still had the opportunity to use the internet and keep in touch with each other. Thomas was extremely focused on the matter, and this kind of hobby helped him to distract himself and relax for a while. The man in the video explained how to properly secure the protruding parts, and a few moments later he presented the result, a cute little sheep. Thomas turned his attentive gaze to the monitor, examining the toy. His own creation was on a completely different level and clearly did not reach the level of a toy. This undoubtedly upset Michael. Thus, a whole year has passed since the beginning of the war. Although there were no more bombings, a completely new threat appeared. Monsters have taken over the entire region, and the government has completely lost control of the situation. The old life has become a long-forgotten dream. Also, on the forum lately, there has been more and more talk about refugees. The number of people who had not been online for a long time also increased significantly, and soon suspicions turned into fear and hatred. Thomas read another dispute on the forum and became more and more convinced of this. He understood that these emotions were not without reason. By clicking on the button, he blocked the user named Defender in the chat so as not to see his posts. Immediately after the war began, a man appeared who was nicknamed the Manhunter on the forum. He posted numerous accounts of his exploits. It was obvious that he was not killing for fun at all. The real reason was much simpler and more prosaic. It was a warning. However, when the hero pulled this man from the blacklist to view his latest posts, he realized that the hunter had become addicted to killing. And now anyone who follows his posts on a regular basis will become aggressive and suspicious. A few days later, he received a shocking notification that anonymous person 337, who made the toys, had not been online for a long time. It wasn't hard to guess what this could mean. Thus, another 6 months passed and a harsh winter came. The number of inactive users has exceeded the number of active ones many times over. Everyone had already gotten used to the fact that people were constantly disappearing, and no one knew when their turn would come, including our hero, so he was extremely wary. While on patrol today, he noticed a truck with 4 men approaching his base. Looking closer, he recognized them as the builders who had helped build his shelter. Soon the truck stopped and the men got off, holding their guns at the ready. Thomas realized that the 4 had gone on a looting spree and were revisiting their old clients. A grin appeared on the hero's face. Turning around, he returned back to his shelter. Having reached the necessary locker, the hero stopped. Opening it, he glanced over the array of weapons collected there, deciding that he should welcome his guests as hospitably as possible. With these thoughts, he chose the axe that had already become familiar to him. Meanwhile, the men also reached the bunker, but they were alarmed by the fact that the entrance door was open. Turning around, Paul ordered the 2 men following him to go forward and scout out the situation. Without objection, they immediately went inside the bunker. They looked around cautiously and were ready to attack at any moment as soon as they noticed a threat. Suddenly, something caught Nick's attention and he stopped. As the light from the flashlight illuminated the many boxes of food, he couldn't help but let out a cry of delight. Paul, following behind him, looked around again and said that he didn't like it at all because he had a nagging feeling that they were being lured into a trap. When Pavel, who remained at the entrance, asked if everything was clear, Paul replied that no danger had been detected yet. Then he shouted for them to go deeper and look around, because there must definitely be someone inside. At that very moment, our hero jumped from the ceiling, aiming at Nick, who was carrying a protective shield. Thomas hit the shield straight on, causing the man to cry out in surprise and fall to the floor, crushing his partner underneath him. Paul didn't lose his head and, aiming his gun, began to shoot at the hero, but he easily dodged, simultaneously throwing an axe at the enemy. Nick watched in horror as his opponent was hacked to death with an axe. Thomas took advantage of this moment and jumped on the shield, pushing the man underneath him into the floor. When the tension suddenly eased, Nick peered out from behind the shield cautiously. As soon as he did this, he saw Thomas raise the picked-up axe over his head to strike. Seized with horror, Nick began to beg him for mercy. But our hero was not so merciful, so all the pleas fell on deaf ears. Having killed him, Thomas turned towards the entrance when Pavel's excited voice was heard from there. He slowly walked towards the entrance. Meanwhile, Pavel, who was on the street, asked his partner to throw a couple of tear gas canisters inside. Thomas heard their plans perfectly well, thanks to the fact that he was hiding nearby at the entrance. However, he was not so simple as to surrender to the enemy so easily. The next moment, he hit the button on the wall nearby with his fist with an axe in his hand. A malicious grin appeared on his face. Being on his own territory, our hero had a couple of aces up his sleeve for such cases. The door automatically slammed shut with a bang. The men standing outside did not have time to put their plan into action. Pavel suggested finding a ventilation shaft and smoking out the enemy through it. He said that there was only one entrance to this bunker, and in fact, there was only one exit. If they threw a couple of grenades into the ventilation, Thomas would be trapped. At this time, the hero returned back to the weapons cabinet and took the rifle. Afterwards, he pushed the locker aside, thinking that he never thought that a fight against ordinary marauders would turn into such problems. However, his enemies didn't know something either. After the builders finished their work, Thomas expanded the bunker himself, relying on his knowledge. So they have no idea that there is another way out here. It took Thomas a little less than 2 minutes to reach it. Opening the door, he stepped outside. Afterwards, he looked around, trying to find his target with his eyes. The hero walked extremely carefully so as not to attract attention to himself ahead of time, focusing on the voices coming from nearby. Meanwhile, Luke had already pulled the pin from the grenade. At that moment, Thomas came out from behind a tree and shot at the man. It hit him right in the head, causing confusion and shock among his 2 comrades. Pavel didn't understand what was happening and watched with surprise on his face as Luke fell dead, and then another one fell from the shot. Looking at Thomas, he raised his hands and shouted that he surrendered. The hero coldly asked how many more of them were here. Pavel closed his eyes and replied that he was the last one. But the hero did not believe his words and put the gun to the man's forehead. His eyes immediately widened in horror, and he said that there were only 5 of them, including him. So there was no one else left here. With Thomas's gun pointed at him, Pavel carried all the bodies into the truck. Suddenly, something caught our hero's attention. Shock was frozen on his face. Lowering his rifle, he walked closer to the truck and began to feel around its bottom with his hand, causing Pavel to become puzzled. A few moments later, he pulled out a familiar bloody toy sheep. At the sight of her, anger instantly overwhelmed him. Grabbing the rifle with both hands, he hit Pavel on the head with it, causing him to fall to the ground. Afterwards, with a clear threat in his voice, he asked what they had done with the man who was the owner of this doll. The man immediately waved his hand, saying that Thomas had misunderstood everything. The hero didn't find this answer very convincing, so Pavel received another strong blow. Then he grabbed him by the chest with one hand, lifting him up slightly. Covering himself with his hands, the man shouted that they had not killed anyone in the shelter. When they got there was only one dead old man, and they had only cleaned out the shelter and left. Thomas asked Pavel to take him to that bunker, and 30 minutes later, a truck ride later, They were there. The hero was pleasantly surprised that this place was so close. It was not difficult for him to recognize the bunker from the anonymous video 337 at first glance. When they went inside, they saw a bloody body not far from the entrance. His head was wrapped in film, and on it was a sticker with the inscription Defender, which the hunter leaves on each of his victims. The hero heard the sound of a shot as if it were real. He slowly turned his head towards the imaginary killer. He finished his work and walked away with a smile on his face. Thomas was adamant that the hunter was also behind this death, and since this shelter was found, it was only a matter of time before his bunker was discovered too. Our hero lingered here a little longer, carefully examining the corpse. He knew better than anyone that corpses could tell a lot more than they might seem at first glance. Thomas was instantly flooded with memories of his past as a military man. Thanks to his rich experience and good observation, the hero could accurately determine not only the cause of death, but also the conditions in which the victim found himself at the time of death. It was not difficult for him to establish even the patterns of the criminal's behavior. He had been doing this kind of work for many years. Therefore, he was also able to determine the attitude towards the death of the current criminal quite easily. Pavel, who had been standing quietly to the side all this time, carefully asked if Thomas would let him go now. Instead of answering, he pointed the gun at him, causing confusion in the man who put his palms in front of him, saying that he had already done everything that was required of him. Seeing that there was no reaction to his words, he shouted that he also had reasons for doing this, because he had children, and without him, they would die. But even these words did not touch Thomas. He still kept the gun aimed. Pavel began to slowly back away, pressing on the children's pity. When the hero got tired of this, he said that there was a small misunderstanding, because he would never spare a marauder who knew the location of his bunker. For Pavel, these words sounded like a sentence, which was carried out at that very moment by Thomas, after which our hero left the bunker, leaving the bodies there. A few months later, spring came and our hero began to go outside more often. He had lived in the bunker too long and had come to appreciate the warm, fresh air outside, enjoying the blissful peace in the sun. At such moments, Thomas felt like this place was a real paradise on earth. However, nothing can last long, and the hero understood this. Filled with a strange premonition, Thomas opened his eyes and saw a drone flying in the sky. He slowly approached him. Not long ago, someone wrote on the forum that he also saw a flying drone in the sky, and now someone is trying to break into his bunker using welding and also warned that he is going to blow up his bunker in case of emergency. This post attracted a lot of attention and also helped to reveal a frightening truth to everyone. Namely, that the marauders are becoming more and more inventive and cunning. They can also try on the masks of members of the surviving community. Therefore, the information that is necessary for survival may one day become their undoing. On the day this post came out, every survivor realized this. Just like they will have to fight for their own lives, whether they want to or not. Over time, some began to unite into groups. Group survival quickly gained popularity. Our hero had a completely different opinion regarding all this, because he believed that a large group was easier to notice or track down. He considered stealth to be the best way to survive. It gave him more advantages over the enemy. In this regard, Thomas's territory is ideal for this method, because there is so little here that neither marauders nor vagabonds simply have any reason to come here. Also, recently a pack of mutated wild dogs settled nearby. From the forum, our hero also learned that radioactive zombies had begun to appear in a nearby city. There were even rumors about an unknown survivor who was cleaning up this city. He shoots them with a sniper rifle, piercing the zombies' heads. But Thomas suspected that this was not all the changes and that something worse was coming. Greg, holding the drone's remote control, swore loudly. They arrived exactly at the place where our hero had been resting not so long ago, but now it was as if he had disappeared into thin air. The man looked out of the truck window and asked his comrades with displeasure whether they had searched carefully enough or if they had simply gotten the wrong place. Patrick, equally displeased, shouted that there were no other Air Force bases nearby and told Greg to send out the drone again. He cursed with displeasure, dreaming of the pleasure he would have in getting rid of Thomas when he found him. Suddenly, something caught his attention. He looked down at the image from the drone, amazed at what he saw. Instead of Thomas, he came across a stranger with a rifle. Judging by her clothes, Greg was sure that she was an American soldier. Pleased with this, he looked out the window again and shouted that he had found a better victim and they needed to turn around. But before he could finish speaking, he noticed the frozen horror on the faces of his comrades. They were attacked by mutated wild dogs. Right before Greg's eyes, they devoured everyone outside one by one. This horrific sight left the man in shock. The man in the driver's seat immediately hit the pedals, getting out of there as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the torn body of one of their former comrades flew under their wheels. The man landed on their car with a thud, hitting the windshield. It instantly cracked, completely obscuring the driver's vision, and the truck crashed into a pole. Greg did not survive the accident, but Paul, who was driving, miraculously survived. However, the joy of survival did not last long. Horror was reflected on his face, distorted by pain. A huge monster's head penetrated inside. It was no trouble for the wild dog to devour the immobilized victim. Afterwards, a photo from the accident site was uploaded to the forum with a caption stating that wild animals had dragged a group of marauders towards the forest. Thomas, however, decided that he should be more careful if he didn't want to accidentally run into the mutant dogs. Suddenly, while he was sitting and thinking about this post, he received a message from the user who had previously written that he had been tracked down and was going to blow up his bunker. This time, he wrote again about the explosion and asked for help, but after the last time, no one believed him. So when the looters broke into the bunker, despair overwhelmed him, and he had no choice but to actually blow everything up. Almost everyone heard the explosion, and the forum came alive again, discussing what had happened. Thomas decided that he didn't need to delve into this now, because there were more important things to do, or rather a threat that got too close to him. He picked up the drone's control panel, which depicted a girl with a rifle. Thomas decided it was time for him to meet his neighbors. Alexa noticed a drone following her, so she immediately got rid of it. Later in the evening, Thomas visited the place where he last saw the girl from the video and stopped at a half-survived high-rise building. He glanced around the building with a careful gaze. Alexa reacted instantly, firing her rifle. The bullet flew straight at the American woman's approaching enemy. The zombie was knocked down by this one attack. Thomas managed to hide behind the bus. Now he had no way back. He entered the territory of his neighbor, a mad sniper. Carefully emerging from his hiding place, the hero dropped to one knee and began to carefully examine something on the ground. His attention was drawn to the bullets in the ground. Thomas found it strange that the warning shot holes were too close to the aimed ones, which only meant that Alexa had no choice but to shoot. This guess gave him the idea that this girl was in some sense even more dangerous than that bomber. The hero originally came here to learn more about his neighbor, whom he found using a drone. Based on the girl's appearance and her equipment, Thomas was certain that she was a member of the U.S. military forces stationed in Korea. At the very beginning of the war, the United States, being in the position of the strongest country in the world, intercepted most of the nuclear missiles and protected the main territory, but the main problems began later. They withdrew all their external combat assets, including those from Korea. They had to try to defend themselves from the rifts from which the monsters were crawling out. While Alexa was here, our hero understood that he would not be able to have full control over the Air Force base and calmly conduct reconnaissance. He would like to avoid clashes with trained soldiers, but if someone enters his territory, then a clash cannot be avoided. He has no intention of living with a threat at his side. The hero guarded this multi-story building for about a week. During this time, he managed to study the enemy's behavior patterns. The first thing he noticed was that the shooting stopped at about the same time every day. Thomas assumed that this was the time Alex went to bed, and that this was the only time he could approach the building without getting shot. As he had already found out, the entrance was blocked by a barricade, so he had only one option to get inside. Namely, through the roof of another building, which he took advantage of, boldly jumping from the roof to the opposite side. He managed to successfully grab onto the ledge of the floor of the desired building. Thomas glanced down. If he fails to climb up and falls down, he will most likely run into the protruding pins. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. In the next movement, the hero climbed onto a hard surface with one jerk. Thomas immediately grabbed his weapon and took aim, ready for the fact that he could be attacked at any moment. However, he found no one here, so he walked forward carefully, trying not to make unnecessary noise. Thomas was extremely focused and alert. In this way, he reached the stairs and began to climb up them just as carefully. Having climbed one flight, he stopped, looking around for enemies. In this way, he reached the top floor where the sniper's hideout was located. He quietly approached the door and opened it, walking inside. The first thing Thomas saw in front of him was a man sleeping in a sleeping bag a couple of meters away from him. Suddenly, Alexa appeared behind him with an aimed rifle and ordered him to lower the weapon. Thomas didn't expect to be lured into a trap. He lowered his gun and raised his free hand up. The hero glanced cautiously at the American woman, wondering when she had noticed him. Judging by her voice, he assumed that this was the girl he had seen from the drone. Realizing that his opponent was not simple, Thomas remained on guard and did not take his finger off the trigger. Alex repeated with emphasis in her voice once again for him to put the weapon on the floor. But Thomas did not react. Continuing to analyze the situation, he noticed for himself that the girl was standing relatively close to him and that she was definitely not holding a gun in her hands because the barrel was quite long. He sighed, released his grip, and his weapon fell to the floor. But the next moment, he turned sharply, grabbing the barrel of Alexa's rifle with his hand. The girl fired, hoping to hit Thomas, but he dodged without lowering his hand from the weapon. While Alexa continued shooting, the hero got a little closer to her. He then kicked her in the thigh, trying to weaken his opponent's stance. But when that didn't work, he hit her under the knee. The girl's legs immediately buckled and she screamed in pain. Alexa lay on the floor, breathing heavily and holding onto her aching leg with her hand. Suppressing the pain, she crawled forward to pick up the weapon. But Thomas interrupted her plans by stepping on her lower back. The hero measured the girl beneath him with a cold gaze. She couldn't even say anything because of the pain. Sighing, the hero said that he didn't want this to happen. Initially, he only planned to check how many people were here. But while he was examining the building, he came across an arsenal and he really wouldn't want local looters to ever get to it. Alexa gave him a displeased look, saying nothing. Thomas also frowned and, aiming his gun at her, said that if she wanted to live so much, then she should have sat quietly, and the blame for her carelessness lay only with her. Suddenly, the hero heard a rustling sound behind him and reacted instantly. taking out a pistol with his free hand and pointing it towards the entrance. Despite Alexa's cries of protest, the steps grew closer, and soon the stranger himself entered. Thomas was surprised when he saw a little girl in front of him, timidly walking towards him. Michelle looked at her mother in surprise, who was under the gun's sights, and froze. The hero was confused and lost his concentration for a few moments. This was enough for Alex to turn around and punch Thomas's hand with the gun. He jumped aside, surprised that the American woman still had the strength to resist, while she also managed to arm herself with a pistol. Thomas decided that he needed to finish her off before she was ready to defend herself, so he aimed his gun at her with determination. However, the next moment something happened that he never expected. Alexa rushed towards her daughter, hugging her. The hero slowly turned his uncomprehending gaze towards them. He thought the girl would jump for the rifle, as this would increase both her and her daughter's chances of survival, but she did otherwise. Thomas sighed heavily. Realizing that his assumption about a mad sniper was wrong, Alexa simply found herself in an untamed jungle, in which she was desperately trying to survive. She managed to survive in a foreign country while protecting her daughter only because she pulled the trigger at the first sign of danger. Thomas approached her and knocked the gun out of her hand with one blow. Then he pointed towards the streets and said that that land belonged to him. He gestured with a gun, saying that if she went in there, she would die. Nodding towards the girl, the hero added that Alexa should not stick her nose in there, but sit here and keep an eye on the child. Although the American woman was in no hurry to answer, he was sure that she should have understood this. Suddenly, she asked if he had any medicine. When he asked why they needed them, Alexa lifted her left pant leg, revealing bloody bandages wrapped around it. Even with the naked eye, it was clear that the wound was serious. Thomas took something out of his pocket and threw it to the girl, saying that these were antibiotics and anti-inflammatories that should help. Alexa carefully examined the box with the drug. Looking up at the boy in front of her, she said that that wasn't what she meant. The American woman bit her lip and asked if the hero had any drugs. He was surprised by her question. In part, he could understand her. Naturally, in such a situation, one wants to find any comfort, even if it is illusory. Looking Alex in the eyes, the hero said that drugs are not a cure for all diseases and a good ending awaited no one with them. He then pointed to Michelle and asked if she knew Korean. From that day on, Thomas began to support the two, regularly delivering medications and skim milk to them at the agreed-upon location. He also noted that in recent days there have been significantly more shots. Although the frequency of the shots was high, it did not resemble a shootout. Even on the day of their first meeting, Thomas realized that Alexa was already on the edge. And with each new day, her condition gets worse. She doesn't hit the enemies in her sights, but the demons in her head. Suddenly, a bright beam blinded him. Thomas stopped and looked towards the already familiar building, in the window of which something was glittering. He almost immediately recognized the Morse code that Alex used to tell him about the meeting place. However, her daughter came to the meeting instead of her. The hero immediately noticed her worried expression. Michelle explained in Korean that her mother was not feeling well, after which she led him into the building where Alexa was. Thomas immediately noted that their entire shelter was littered with all sorts of American symbols, from the flag to movie posters. Noticing their appearance, Alexa rose from the floor. Afterwards, the hero helped her bandage the wound, and the girl explained the situation in a mixture of English and Korean. The hero understood that everything was very bad, because the marauders were increasingly flocking to the sounds of gunfire, and the wounds on his leg were getting worse due to the delayed treatment. When the bandaging was finished, Michelle sank down next to her mother, wrapping her in a tight embrace. Suddenly, Alexa admitted with sadness in her voice that she missed home. She remembered the friends and acquaintances she left there. The American woman understood that it was simply impossible to return home in the current situation, and this really hurt her heart. Michelle brushed away a lone tear that rolled down her chin. Without turning to face him, Alexa asked Thomas again if he had any drugs. His gaze immediately became heavy. Memories of the tragic fate of another family, which he accidentally witnessed, surfaced in his mind. Afterwards, he said that even if he had them, he would not have given them to her, because no matter how much you run away from reality, the problems will still not go away. In return, he promised to help her. But for this, he will need a weapon. Sometime later, our hero found a refuge for marauders. He waited for the rain on purpose because it was the best moment to leave his territory. The rain severely limits visibility, and the cold forces people to huddle in groups around the fire. Thomas looked around and noticed boxes of ammunition nearby. Among them, he found flare guns, which would be very useful to him now. The hero took out one of them, equipping his weapon. Even though the enemy had an advantage in numbers, Thomas could easily get rid of this problem with the help of missiles. The men sitting by the fire were closest to him, so they became his first target. The rocket he launched caused a powerful explosion. Although the number of injured opponents was great, he had expected more. Those who were not caught in the explosion ran as far away from here as possible. But Thomas couldn't let them do that. Having changed weapons, he fired continuously at the enemies. They tried to hide or run away, but the same end awaited them. Suddenly, Thomas noticed someone approaching from the side. He instantly turned around and began shooting at the enemies who had crept up on him. One of the marauders opened fire and, aiming at Thomas, shot through his cloak. The men tried their best to hit him, but the hero was faster and avoided the bullets. When he disappeared from the sight of the marauders, they were confused, wondering where he had disappeared to and how many people had come with him. The leader of the marauders ordered one of the men to go for help, and he immediately went towards the trucks. At that very moment, the leader's head was shot. Another man followed him, and only Jack, who had been sent for help, remained alive. After stopping the shooting, Thomas emerged from the shadows and began to slowly approach Jack. He said that the more they reach for the light in such a tense situation, the more exposed they become. In horror, Jack tripped over his own feet and fell to the ground. All the deaths he saw and the axe that Thomas held in his hand told him that he would not leave here alive. The hero stopped next to the man and raised his axe to strike, saying that he wanted to finish this quickly and return home. As soon as everything was over, he returned back to the bunker. He also invited Anna and Michelle with him, because it would be more convenient for him to take care of them for some time. The girl walked around and looked at everything with interest. When she asked Thomas why the toilet was in the very center of the room, he told her to sit next to her mother and not ask unnecessary questions. He himself continued bandaging Alexa's leg. A couple of minutes later, everything was ready. All this time, Michelle continued to explore the room, looking into various nightstands, which caused great irritation to our hero. Sighing, he turned his attention back to Alexa getting dressed and said that he had done everything according to the video, so everything should be fine. The girl said nothing in response to this. The hero strongly doubted that she would immediately feel better because he could only heal external wounds, but not mental ones. While thinking about this, he looked into his open laptop and suddenly it dawned on him. Alexa followed his gaze. Thomas moved his laptop a little closer to her, allowing her to look at the screen. He showed the English version of the Long Live the Apocalypse forum. The hero assumed that since the American domain was the main one, there should be many times more users there. He hoped that at least this way he would be able to dull the pain in Alexa's heart. The girl had never used this forum and hesitantly asked if it was somehow connected with the States. In response, Thomas nodded and advised her to try writing something there. After his words, she turned her gaze back to the screen. Afterwards, she timidly touched the keyboard with her fingers and typed a banal greeting. Even though it was a small thing, a smile appeared on Alexa's face for the first time in a long time. Time moved inexorably forward, and now the second Christmas after the apocalypse has arrived. Recently, the free game Decorate the Christmas Tree, made by a former developer, has gained popularity. Our hero's tree was almost empty and it wasn't popular, but the trees of famous users were littered with comments, one of which was hung with balloons with the inscriptions corpse, murder, psychopath, killer. The hero was interested in looking through similar trees of other users from time to time. Suddenly, Michelle's voice came over the radio. Thomas immediately asked how Alexa was. The girl replied that she had fallen asleep, but wanted to borrow the laptop for a while to spend the New Year's countdown with people from North America. The day he first gave Alexa a laptop, she visibly perked up and thanked him for the opportunity he had given her. Then she said her name and her daughter's name. Thomas decided not to give his name, but to settle on a nickname from the forum, since then the hero has been in constant contact with these two. When he replied that he would bring it soon and was about to turn off, Michelle asked him to wait a little, after which she took a deep breath and wished him a Merry Christmas. The hero hadn't heard anything like this for a long time, so he was very surprised at first. A few moments later, a slight smile touched his lips. He also wished them a Merry Christmas. Suddenly, Thomas received a message that someone had decorated his tree. At the very top, a red ball appeared with the inscription John Lennon. This name was familiar to our hero, and he was surprised that he had the chance to meet him again. He was immediately interested in who had drawn a parallel between him and the owner of this name. After all, this ghost was known to many people, but especially to Thomas. Let's go back 2.5 years when the online community Long Live the Apocalypse was just created. Its server was located on a separate satellite, and all the illegal information that was justified by its subject matter was located there. This largest anonymous resource dedicated to the apocalypse was used by people from all over the world. It was promoted in various ways, and our hero also became interested in it. However, he couldn't afford to buy a subscription right away, and he didn't see the point in spending money to read all the show-offs of the rich. Thomas initially started using this forum because it was difficult to cook something on his own, but he was unable to find any useful information on the forum. So he decided to invest his money in a bunker. Suddenly, an article with an interesting title caught his eye. It was the first time he came across John Lennon's post about the need for fake bunkers. It was written there that when it comes to long-term survival, the tactical and strategic advantage provided by such bunkers is difficult to overestimate. They could be connected to the main bunker and used for reconnaissance and surveillance purposes or simply to mislead the enemy. It was also recommended to mine them in advance if the bunker was captured. Thomas found this article incredibly useful and interesting. He looked through several more of John's articles, in which he found many varied and extremely well-thought-out things, and the hero also noticed that the author of the post's philosophy of survival was similar to his own. This man interested him, and Thomas became interested in finding out what John Lennon was doing. Not only he, but also many other forum users became interested in him, but revealing John's mysterious identity turned out to be not so easy. Thomas followed every new discussion and post closely. One day, John finally responded to the forum users. From the attached photo of the ID, the hero realized that this man was a hunter. About 10 years ago, strange phenomena began to appear all over the world, which people called rifts. Soon, terrible creatures began to appear from the rifts, and each country began to create a squad to fight them. They began to be called hunters. These people fought tirelessly against the monsters that appeared from the rifts. The very first such detachment in Korea consisted of only 4 people. Our hero was a part of it. As the monster approached, his 3 partners immediately aimed their weapons at the enemy and began firing. The hero wielded the axe mercilessly. No one relaxed their vigilance after killing the enemy because everyone knew that it was not the end. The identities of the top-class hunters were kept as a state secret. Each of them was an elite soldier who had undergone the most brutal training and many battles. So looking at John's license, Thomas could say with certainty that he was not one of those hunters. But even so, the very existence of such a license contributed to a greater growth in its popularity. All this was supported by his broad knowledge, which was entirely in keeping with his position. Thus, John Nannen very quickly became the most famous figure in the whole society. But not everything was so smooth. Along with his popularity, he also gained many envious people. They pressed hard on his every post, looking for the slightest flaw. However, all these attacks were unfounded and would not leave even a stain on John's reputation. When users questioned his real identity, Thomas was interested in the reaction of his idol. He assumed that he would not respond to such obvious provocations. But to his surprise, John responded by posting a photo of himself. This photo only caused confusion and disappointment among people. Community interest has abruptly declined. It was later discovered that John only had a D rank, the lowest possible for a hunter. Thomas believed that John should have continued to simply post informational posts and not drown himself, but to the hero's surprise, he went even further. John Nannen organized a meeting with fans. Thus, a year before the disaster, the first fan meeting was held. John Nannen thanked everyone for coming here and then said that on the forum it was just his nickname, but in real life his name is Ian. Including our hero, there were only 10 people gathered at the table. When the waiter came to their table, John ordered enough pork belly for 9 people, citing his diet. The woman replied that there were 10 of them there and she only accepted orders per person, and he had to order a dish for 10. Thomas noted that although John had said earlier that he was sitting on the table, as soon as the food appeared on the table, he immediately pounced on the meat and beer. It seemed as if he had not eaten for several days or simply wanted to fully recoup his money. After this, 2 middle-aged men who, judging by their clothes, were quite wealthy, clicked their tongues in displeasure and left. The hero decided to stay longer. Their conversation smoothly turned to speculation about the coming war, which would most likely be unleashed by China, since they have serious problems with the faults and some internal units are rebelling, ignoring orders from the center. Thomas also noted that John was telling things that had long been known to everyone, and all his information was out of date by at least 6 months. The man's pink face spoke of the amount of alcohol he had drunk, and suddenly his gaze caught on our hero. As soon as Thomas mentioned his nickname from the forum, John immediately remembered it and asked how the construction in his bunker was progressing. The hero looked down and replied that new problems arise every day and he cannot find a company that makes decent fuel tanks. When John replied that he had heard about a similar problem and nothing immediately came to mind, Thomas became completely disappointed in him because he had already realized that in fact this man had neither knowledge nor connections and that he should not be expected to help. But John's next suggestion that he could take up the matter greatly surprised our hero. He took out his cell phone and said he could ask around and see if something would come up. Having said this, he began to look for the required number in his contacts. A couple of minutes later, he had already contacted one of his friends and said that he needed a company that dealt with fuel tanks. A month later, Thomas installed the fuel tank. Thanks to John's help, he managed to bring his bunker to mind. Despite the first bad impression, he turned out to be quite a useful acquaintance. Afterwards, John continued to hold his meetings, and at the last one, he managed to attract about 80 people. Thomas decided that this was his last meeting because he was already pretty tired of listening to the nonsense that was constantly being said here. Suddenly, John came up to him and asked if he had a couple of free minutes. The two of them went outside. The hero was in no hurry to start a conversation first, trying to understand what John wanted from him. After a few moments, the man spoke himself, saying that he had one question. He turned his gaze to Thomas and asked if he was a hunter. The hero simply looked at him for a few seconds, hesitating to answer. Then he asked if he really looked so much like a hunter. John replied that he had a strange feeling, as if he had seen Thomas before. He stood firm in his opinion, and the hero looked down, not reacting to his words. Thomas is confident that his identity as a hunter was strictly classified, so John could not have any information. And in order not to reveal himself, he needed to come up with something urgently. When he turned to him to voice his invented excuse, he was no longer there. The other guys came out of the establishment looking for John, saying that reporters had come here and wanted to see him. One of the men noticed Thomas standing nearby and asked what they were talking about. Without waiting for an answer, he pushed John towards the entrance, saying that if it was not something important, then he should hurry. John looked towards Thomas and wanted to say something, but didn't have time. The next moment, a female reporter appeared at the door. All the man's attention was immediately focused on her. He smiled and said that it looked like he really should hurry. Once, when someone asked why John was so busy with that guy, he replied that Thomas just looked like someone he knew. The hero did not follow the crowd, but went home. This was their last meeting in person. John Nennan soon became a real star and appeared on many broadcasts as a representative of the apocalypse and an expert on the issue of the end of the world, thanks to which he further strengthened his position. Later, he even began giving lectures. He also monetized his fame as the doomsday seller to the fullest. He provided special consultations for the rich. John didn't just ride the wave, he worked his oars with all his might to rise even higher. And the main springboard for his success were the guys from the forum. John was intoxicated with his fame and power. After all, the forum users worshipped him like God, and he watched their reactions and began to believe that they would continue to follow him like sheep. But it was precisely this approach that became his end. Over time, the truth came out that he had copied all the posts from the European forum, and this caused a lot of indignation. As a result, an entire army of armchair detectives took up a detailed investigation, and the bubble called John Nennan burst. Thomas himself was irritated by the fact that this man was literally everywhere already, so he was glad that everything ended this way. Although John managed to take off quickly, he fell much faster, and the anonymous people from the forum who started the bullying made everything much worse. He made no attempt to defend himself in any way from unfortunate suspicions and criticism. The last sign of life he showed remained forever in the history of the forum. Thus, the rising star long live the apocalypse faded away. Now Thomas was looking thoughtfully at the monitor screen. He wondered who had drawn the parallel between the two of them. The thought that it was just a coincidence immediately crossed his mind, but instead a suspicion crept in that it could have been John Nennan himself. Thomas sat back down at the monitor, moving the keyboard closer. On the forum, he found the account he needed of one of the anonymous people and wrote to him. The hero asked if he could tell him who left the message on his tree. When he replied that he would think about it if Thomas told him why he needed it. Having told a couple of details, the hero leaned back in his chair, waiting for an answer. He knew that GameFox was a hacker and former game developer who made this game, so he had no doubt that he would be able to find out who it was. At that moment, Thomas had no idea what this curiosity would turn into for him. About half an hour later, the GameFox sent him the name of the user who left the message, and the hero thanked him for his help. Immediately after this, he found the person he needed on the forum and, going into the chat, asked who he was, since they had definitely not crossed paths before. The threat hanging over the hero came from a direction he didn't even suspect. Sometime later, the National Crisis Management Authority made an announcement that they were reopening the disaster response headquarters. Having heard everything he needed, Thomas turned off the radio, after which he began to pack his bag, putting in food and water for 3 days. He also did not forget about weapons for self-defense. The state was still holding on thanks to the surviving top brass, but the hero did not place much hope in them. But while the concept of the nation still lived in the minds of people, Thomas could take advantage of this, which is why he was looking for a place for a bunker closer to the city. Having collected everything he needed, he looked over his clothes, making sure that they were the most ordinary and would not attract much attention. Having prematurely checked that there was no one near the bunker, Thomas decided to go outside. It's time for him to see what Seoul has become a year and a half after the nuclear bomb fell. The road to the city itself was rather boring, but as soon as he entered the city itself, strewn with ruins, the picture changed dramatically. This view evoked complex and contradictory emotions in the hero. All that remains of the Seoul that Thomas knew is its name. Thinking about this, a strong sadness came over him, but that was not all. When he saw other survivors who, having lost their homes, began to live on the destroyed streets, a joy arose deep in his soul that in the new world, he was who he was. In a small alley opposite, he noticed a mountain of corpses and people with canisters in green suits. They poured gasoline on the corpses and set them on fire. This picture did not surprise him because he had already witnessed something similar many times. Sometime later, he arrived at the building of the National Crisis Management Office. As he approached the information window, the woman sitting at the desk said in a boring voice that complaints and crime reports were submitted to a different window. The hero interrupted her and said that he wanted to meet with Director Leon Neal, which made the woman look up at him. Having said this, Thomas handed her his hunting ID. Afterwards, he said that he now had to deal with the aftermath of the disaster. He also asked me to tell Leon that Thomas Yu, with whom he had been at military school, was looking for him. The hero smiled, saying that upon hearing this, Leon would immediately remember him. The National Committee is a body responsible for governing the country and its restoration. Now, this institution was both the administrative and military center of Korea. Key positions here are occupied by graduates of the former Hunters Academy, one of whom is the managing committee, former hunter Leon Neal. Thomas was sure that his former comrade would not want to see him, and it was absolutely mutual. Suddenly, someone approached him. When the man stopped next to him, the hero asked what was the matter. He said that recently the battles were becoming more and more difficult and they lacked people, especially those with combat experience. Thomas understood what he was getting at and refused, saying that he had already been suspended from service. He understood that given the kind of war they were currently waging, the number of soldiers was much more important than their quality, and they had stopped recruiting just anyone. Now they were looking for courageous, promising soldiers. But Thomas will never sign up for this, because he is not at all attracted by the prospect of dying on the front lines. Adjusting his glasses, the man confidently said that he had heard that Thomas was a hunter. The hero sighed loudly and covered his face with his hand, holding back his irritation. After standing like that for a few moments, he looked at the man again and asked who had sent him here, whether it was the case manager, but he replied that it was another person. When he heard the name called to him, he was surprised, because he had not expected to hear it at all. Thomas froze, digesting the information he had received. Afterwards, he asked in bewilderment whether Ksenia Reed was really on the National Committee. He was immediately flooded with memories of the times when he was still a military man. He and Ksenia served together, and he often told her not to think about other people's opinions, and that the end should justify any means. The girl had much less experience, so they took breaks from time to time so that she could recover, and during them, Thomas gave her various pieces of advice. And the girl persistently followed him, remembering everything that was told to her. Now he met her for the first time in many years. Taking a break from her reports, Ksenia greeted her old acquaintance. The first thing he noticed on her desk was a photo frame with her family photo. The girl decided to skip the formalities and get straight to the point, saying that they needed hunters. Thomas wearily said that he had to ask the classic question, "Why me?" But everything was perfectly clear here, in response to which he heard the remark that he was still trying hard to avoid military service. Without taking his eyes off her, he reminded her that they had once agreed that she would not work for the state. In response to this attack, Ksenia asked whether old promises meant anything in today's world. The hero knew the answer to this question perfectly well. He sighed and replied that that was exactly why he left, because he never wanted to do anything like that again. Ksenia interrupted him and said that the manager Leon Neal had already sent a request as well. What he heard did not please our hero at all. Noticing his expression, Ksenia said that he no longer held a grudge against Thomas. At least he was definitely not in a position to do so. She bit her lip in displeasure when the hero mockingly said that the world had changed as soon as Leon took the higher seat. Throwing a displeased glance at him, Ksenia said that he should be perfectly aware of the situation they were all in now and what was happening on the front lines every day. After her words, silence reigned in the office. Thomas was in no hurry to answer anything. He knew perfectly well what Ksenia was talking about. He didn't even have to imagine the horrible images because fragments of memories of everything he had witnessed floated into his head. That was the whole problem. He desperately didn't want to go back to that life. Ksenia noticed how his fists clenched in his pockets. Sighing, she looked down and apologized regretfully. Afterwards, she asked him if he knew anything about the P Corporation, and when he answered negatively, she told him that they would need help in hunting monsters, which is why they had turned to them, but they had nothing to help them with now. Ksenia placed her palm on the folder with the report and moved it a little further, after which she said that she wanted Thomas to put on a show there. Hearing her request, the hero was surprised. She assured him that as long as she lived, he would not find himself on the front lines. After looking at her for a few moments, the hero thanked her for it. The girl's gaze softened a little, and she said that everything had changed a lot here, of course. Everyone except Thomas. Many people have wondered what will happen to large industrial conglomerates after the end of the world, and not long ago, a drone discovered the bunker of one of them. It was a whole closed ecosystem which even had golf courses. Thomas understood that leaving the company and social status to which he had dedicated his life in order to protect himself and his family was a natural choice, one that most rich people made. But naturally, there were others among them who could not give up power in the changed world, and among them was the leader of the R Corporation. A month later, the corporation made an appointment with Thomas. Early in the morning, he arrived at the building of the new headquarters, which was designed by a British architect known throughout the world, but the construction was not destined to be completed due to the outbreak of war. So Thomas had to freeze in the construction elevator for quite a long time. Because he had to go up to the 55th floor, the cold was especially noticeable as the elevator approached the top floors. Entering inside, he stopped at the doors of the meeting room. Previously, only the best of the best, the pinnacle of the Korean elite, could enter there. As soon as Thomas walked inside and saw the people gathered there, he realized that nothing had really changed. He glanced at their faces, focusing on just one person. But he didn't even think to turn to face him. Thomas also noticed the workers' ID cards hanging around their necks, although he didn't see any point in them, since there was no electricity. A man approached him from the side with a smile on his face and said that he had heard about the hero. Thomas turned to him and greeted him with his hands outstretched, but the man ignored it and stared at the piece of paper, asking what his rank was. Our hero did not expect that they would start asking him questions right away and answered that he had a D rank. After marking something, the man asked if he had combat experience and in what countries he served. Thomas replied that he had made a couple of small trips to Korea, but had never been a captain, and as for the rifts, he had very little idea what was going on there. Having written everything down, the man said that they would finish here and asked to wait here for a bit. Thomas answered the first thing that came to his mind, so as not to end up somewhere at the front. He knew that most of the records were lost. He was sure that Ksenia had already prepared everything in advance, and that he only needed to pass the minimum threshold to get to the place prepared for him. While thinking about this, the hero did not notice how someone approached him again. The voice of a girl who stopped next to him brought him out of his thoughts. She asked if it was true that he was a hunter. Thomas was a little surprised by her question and was in no hurry to answer it. Without waiting for his answer, Olivia pressed her back against the wall and told him that a whole horde of zombies had appeared in the industrial complex that worked for the P Corporation. Since most of the people defending the complex died, they had to turn to the National Committee for help. Olivia herself considered it complete nonsense that now, when everything was going to hell, people continued to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the company. There was a look of doom on her face. Nodding towards the men seated at the long table, she said that they were just a bunch of crazy people who believed that in a fallen world, something could still be achieved through loyalty to the company. Thomas understood and shared her thoughts, because he himself often asked himself similar questions. Suddenly, Olivia grabbed his hand, handing him a business card, and said with hope in her voice that her father was still in the complex, like many others. Thomas looked down at the business card pressed into his palm, reading the name. When the girl said that her father's name was Cedric Milton and that he was a representative of the subcontractor company to which the team would be sent, the hero's eyes widened slightly in surprise. Olivia hesitated slightly, promising that one day she would repay him in full, but he had to fulfill one request. She desperately asked to save her father. At that moment, Thomas was called out. All the men sitting at the table stood up and headed for the exit. The man conducting the survey called the hero to come with them. When Thomas asked where they were going, he was told that he would find out everything on the spot. This answer made our hero a little nervous. He sighed and took a step forward. But before going further, he turned to Olivia and said that he could not promise anything. After all, hunters are not gods at all, and ordinary people will never understand this. The Korean economy is designed in such a way that without waterways, it would collapse. Although some companies are still managing to hold on, the outcome has long been predetermined, and P Corporation was no exception. When Thomas was brought to the corporation's plant, he was amazed by the weapons located there. He understood that this could only be achieved when the leaders seriously tried to assemble a personal army. A man approached their group and said that they had arrived just in time. Afterwards, he introduced himself as Peter and said that he was currently serving in the National Committee and was a former hunter, and that he would also be a consultant on the upcoming mission. Having said this, he bowed, saying that it was a new meeting. Thomas was surprised that Peter was so young and already a member of the National Committee. He had previously heard that people who were hunters in the past are now treated with special respect. Sometime later, they moved into the conference room to discuss the plan of action. Peter was confident that they should immediately use all the resources available to them. Some did not share his opinion, saying that there were thousands of zombies in the complex alone, and that the operation had already been postponed for a whole month on his advice. Thomas stood to the side in no hurry to intervene in the discussion. Peter held up his index finger, saying that this was exactly the point, because zombies had a limited lifespan and needed to eat something, and in these conditions they wouldn't last more than a month. He was sure that at this point the bulk of the zombies had either already died or were on the verge of dying, and the necromancers themselves, without the support of the zombies, did not pose much of a threat, and they would be able to simply crush them with armored vehicles. Many were unsure if it would actually work, but his confident tone endeared him to everyone, and the men decided to trust him. All this time, besides Thomas, there was one other person who said nothing, the chairman of the R Corporation, Hopper Nat. When Peter asked him what he thought about it, he slowly turned his gaze to the former hunter. After which he said that if the issue could be resolved quickly, he saw no reason to act differently. The hero did not take his eyes off Peter, assessing him. Handsome face, confident voice, and he told in detail about the zombies, offering a well-thought-out strategy. If he didn't have many years of experience behind him, even he would be ready to believe everything said here, let alone the old men gathered here. Peter smiled smugly, happy that everything was going well. Suddenly he remembered something. Turning his gaze to Thomas, he asked him what he thought of their plan. For a few seconds, the hero considered what he should do. Peter's face was full of smiles. He knew that Thomas had been sent here by the National Committee as a hunter, and he was eager to prove his superiority to everyone. Sighing, the hero said that, in his opinion, this was all a big mistake. Peter did not expect such an answer, and asked in bewilderment what it meant. Thomas explained that zombies do not die of hunger, but simply go into suspended animation. This means that they hardly move, their metabolism practically stops, but if they never find food, then in this case, they actually die. Because fresh human meat is constantly supplied to the complex, the zombies will not die. So he proposed to develop a new strategy. The hero wouldn't care if this wrong strategy buried them all, but if it suddenly became his responsibility, then there would be problems, so he had to intervene. He also expressed his disapproval of the use of armored vehicles. He explained that zombies have exceptionally good hearing and sense of smell. Therefore, if they use technology, zombies from all around will come running to them, and in general, Thomas did not understand why they would deploy all their combat resources at once. Unable to bear it any longer, Peter muttered through his teeth that he'd better stop. In response, the hero said that the outcome of a battle is 90% planning. If the plan is bad from the start, then there can be no talk of any success. After these words, Peter lost his self-control and wanted to rush at him, asking in bewilderment who Thomas was to behave so unceremoniously with a committee member, but he was stopped, held in place. The hero ignored his attack, turning away in the other direction. He didn't need approval from such people at all. He was not addressing them at all, but those whose word carried weight, the chairman and the representative of the allied company standing next to him. The latter was the father of the girl who asked Thomas for help. The hero slowly moved towards them, not taking his eyes off the man. Stopping next to him, he put his hand on his shoulder, after which he quietly said that his daughter asked for help, and when he gave the signal, the man should run. As a result of the discussion, Peter finally convinced the management to go along with his crazy plan, and now they were surrounded by a countless crowd of zombies. Machine guns were not scary to them because they somehow managed to break through even them, which made the situation even worse. Peter yelled into the radio for everyone to get their flamethrowers out and fire them. As soon as he gave this order, the connection with 2 tanks was broken. He began to scream even louder, completely not understanding what was happening there. A huge shadow looming over him made the man raise his head and freeze in shock. Something unimaginable was happening before his eyes. A huge necromancer appeared from a huge portal that appeared out of nowhere. He slowly opened his stiff limbs, spreading them out to the sides. Standing behind the representative, Thomas said that it was time for them to get out of here. The man looked at him in bewilderment, and he explained that they were powerless in the current situation. A couple of minutes later, everything within a radius of the nearest kilometers was engulfed in a bright flash of light. Upon returning to headquarters, Ksenia thanked him for his help and expressed her hope that after such a failure, the chairman would at least moderate his ambitions a little. Speaking about him, the girl remembered that the chairman wanted to talk to Thomas one-on-one, which she told him about. The hero was not surprised by this because he suspected that something like this was about to happen. As he headed to the meeting place, he was well aware that they were now actively looking for a replacement for the deceased Peter. So Thomas did not see any reason to go to the meeting, but he was too overcome with curiosity. Entering the building, he looked carefully at the door numbers to determine the one he needed. He stopped for a few moments at one of them and slowly opened the door. Hopper Nat was already waiting for him there. When Thomas sat down at the table, the man said that he had dug a little into his past and was pleasantly surprised, because you don't often meet such people. The hero indifferently replied that all the past remained in the past. Hopper ignored this and said that from what he heard, Leon Neal was no match for him, and now he was almost a legend. He also knew that Thomas was on the same team with 2 legendary saviors of their time. When the man said that he was ready to provide him with everything he needed if Thomas returned to service, the hero sighed tiredly, looking down. Putting the knife aside, he replied that he could only wish Hopper good luck in the future. Immediately after that, he rose from his seat. At the same moment, Hopper seriously said that he was going to fight for that complex again. Hearing this, Thomas froze and turned his gaze to the man. He continued by saying that he was an illegitimate child and initially had no chance to inherit the company, but he went against the odds. So now, when all the time everyone believes that the world can no longer be saved, he is going to go against all odds again, and this time not for himself, and he does not intend to give up. He asked Thomas to at least help them come up with a plan to defeat these monsters. After listening to him, the hero had the thought that too often hopeless fools find themselves at the helm. But that was the whole point of entrepreneurs. Thomas sighed and said he would give one hint. Several more days passed after their meeting, and all this time he closely followed the news to find out how everything turned out in the end. That's why the sound of the notification from the forum immediately attracted the hero's attention.